Now, Lobby Group, the organisation undoing tax abuse, is challenging the rules of Parliament. They argue that the line of accountability is unclear as there is a conflict between whether members of Parliament should account to the party they are aligned to or the voters who elected them. Now, the group argues in affidavits it submitted to the state capture inquiry that the rules of the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces do not satisfy the constitutional provision that states parliamentarians must hold executives to account. Let's get you more on the story now. We're joined by OUTA's Parliamentary Engagement Manager, that's Matt Johnston. Matt, good morning. Thanks so much for your time this morning. I mean, this is an issue, I think, that has been in the public domain for, I would say, more than a decade now, going back to the time when we saw the Speaker in the National Assembly, Baleka Mbete, on several occasions, many would argue, protecting the former President Jacob Zuma when it came to, for example, question and answer sessions. But take us back to this affidavit that OUTA submitted to the State Capture Inquiry. How far does the arguments that you're making in that affidavit date back to?
Morning, Michelle. Thank you. So we basically looked back to 2013 and just tried to see what Parliament was doing as and when state capture was happening. And you've said it, in essence we found that it's measurably the case that members of Parliament are primarily accountable to their political party, and that when issues were raised of serious allegations of state capture, people meddling with government business inappropriately, that those issues were not dealt with properly or that they were ignored completely. And since then, I mean, we've seen several instances of individuals trying to undermine the processes of the committee inquiries into public enterprises, for example, transport. So we've really come to the conclusion that there hasn't been an effective intervention from Parliament, and we see a systemic cause for that. But it goes back to 2013.
I mean, what do the rules say now about parliamentarians holding their own counterparts accountable in the House, whether it's the National Assembly or the National Council of Provinces? Because effectively they are in Parliament surely as representatives of the people of South Africa.
That's right. I mean, the Constitution is very clear about this. There's a very clear reporting line that members of the executive, including ministers, must account to their portfolio committees in Parliament and to standing and select committees of both the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. So the Constitution is not ambiguous at all. It really clearly states that those members must oversee executive conduct and that members of Parliament are only truly accountable to the public.
Yeah.
That's the reporting line, but we haven't really seen that. So at the same time, members of Parliament have actually folded and just really given in to the stronger political clout of members of Parliament as well as executives from state-owned companies coming to account to them. And when the public has felt that we are not satisfied with the manner in which Parliament oversees the executive, that we don't see consequences for individuals who are alleged to be involved in state capture, there's nothing the public can really do.
Yeah.
And I'd like to refer to the Ethics Committee, which is one that actually oversees the conduct of members of Parliament themselves. We've been engaging with them, giving them substantive complaints. This was about 3 years ago we started doing this. But to date, we haven't received any substantive feedback. They seem to have done nothing. And just to use another example, we've sat in the Portfolio Committee on Communications, where they actually took information that OUTA had given them and said, this seems compelling enough, firstly to remove the former Minister of Communications from her position as a Member of Parliament, and also to really undertake criminal prosecution. That was then referred to the Ethics Committee, after which nothing happened. The same with the current chairperson of Home Affairs, who's Mr. Bongani Bongo. He has been alleged to have bribed the advocate who was in charge of the ESCOM inquiry in Parliament to try and silence him. And he still sits as a chairperson of a portfolio committee in Parliament.
Yeah. I mean, when we think back on state capture, when we think about the ongoing effects of state capture, that is one of the biggest questions, isn't it? The fact that there were so many people in the orbit of those who are alleged to be the kingpins of the state capture years, where were they? And so the same applies for Parliament. Where was Parliament during those times?
That's correct. And I mean, yesterday at this investment conference, the President said, we've had enough talk shops and it's time for implementation. So we'd really like to see that being applied to Parliament as well. It is not a talk shop. It is really an institution that's supposed to represent the public interest. And we haven't seen that in practice. So some of the kingpins, as you say, who we believe were at the very core of state capture, they haven't disappeared. They haven't disappeared from public discourse. Instead, many of them have actually moved from ministerial positions during the time of state capture's zenith to chairpersons of committees in Parliament. So they haven't faced any consequences. On the contrary, they've actually moved to comfortable positions where arguably there's not even a measurement of parliamentarians' performance, yet those people earn salaries well above R1 million per annum.
Yeah.
And that's paid for by taxpayers.
Yeah. I mean, Matt, you talk about the, sorry for the interruption there, the Constitution being quite clear in Parliament's duty in terms of oversight of the executive, right? But in terms of parliamentary rules, are those rules as clear, or are they quite open-ended in terms of how MPs can hold the executive to account? I mean, is it essentially a case of MPs doing so at their own discretion?
That's correct. I mean, the Constitutional Court has also ruled in a few instances, for example, in Kandla, on whether or not the ballot to impeach the president should have been secret or not. And every time they actually make it very clear that what the judiciary can do to tell Parliament what they're doing is right or wrong is very limited. And that's because of the separation of powers, right? And that basically means that parliamentarians are basically only accountable to themselves and to the public. But what we've seen in effect is that they only account to their political parties.
Yeah.
And of course, that brings in a conflict of interest. When the political party's interest is in contradiction with public interest, the Constitutional Court has made it clear that the decision then should be very obvious to a member of Parliament. You should go with the decision and the action that would rather favor the public interest as opposed to your own political party.
Absolutely.
And we've seen the opposite of that.
Yeah.
So, yes, the internal rules basically resounds with the Constitution and says we determine our own processes, we determine our own proceedings and the way we do our work. But the problem is, one of the problems that we found is that the definition of oversight and what that really means in practice isn't clear. And ordinary people don't have an opportunity to give their input to say, but this is what it should mean, and this is what it should not mean. And we look at the results. But I would like to just raise one more thing. What's lacking in Parliament's own rules is a clear system of measurement for the performance of individual members of Parliament. There's really also no entry requirements or minimum requirements or qualifications for people to serve as members of Parliament, even though it's the highest authority in the public service. It's basically a political question. Yeah. What are your political interests? Do they lie in line with the party's interests? And if yes, you can be deployed as a member of Parliament. And we don't see that as acceptable.
Absolutely. Matt Johnson, thanks very much for your time. It's very worrying indeed. And what does it say about the People's Parliament? Matt Johnson is OUTA's Parliamentary Engagement Managers. Who do parliamentarians account to? The answer should be easy. It clearly is not as simple as that.